Midwestern dawn 1944. Frost traces the window of a U.S. Army POW hospital ward. Enamel mugs breathe steam on a steel cart. A nurse steadies a tray at the foot of a cot where a thin Japanese sailor sits upright, blanket squared to regulation. On the tray, bread still warm from the post bakery, a wedge of pie that glistens faintly under the bulb, and a small glass bottle capped in paper, milk, cold enough to bead. She checks his chart, notes the weight, nods once and sets the tray into his hands. He stares, unsure which to touch first. Outside, a 2.5-ton truck coughs and idles. Men passing crates of dairy and sacks of flour into a kitchen that runs by schedule more than by appetite. The ward is quiet except for cutlery and the soft shuffle of souls. Calories are medicine here. Dietitians write menus, nurses enforce them, and convalescents learn that recovery tastes like sweet and protein and heat. The rules that power this routine are older than this morning. Rations, equivalent in quantity and quality to depot troops, medical attention and appropriate diet provided as duty, not charity. Beyond the window, a camp the size of a small town begins another day, the place where this abundance will have to be explained. Capture rarely came with warning. In the Bismarck Archipelago and along the New Guinea coast in 1943-44, small groups of exhausted Japanese soldiers and sailors were overrun, cut off or pulled from rafts after convoy battles. Signal Corps cameras caught the first minutes of custody. Men seated on the ground, helmets off, eating from U.S. mess kits under guard. In August 1944, near Talicia, New Britain, a caption made the moment plain. Japanese POWs get first GI food after capture. The picture shows rice-starved faces working through bread, meat and coffee, a meal as much about rules as calories. From the skirmish line, custody moved by echelons, forward cage, theater compound, and if evacuation was ordered, long transit to the continental United States. There the POW system functioned like a shadow army post. Fenced perimeters, towers, roll calls, barracks inspections, infirmaries, chapels, and kitchens run on the same schedule that fed American depot troops. The administrative backbone was the Office of the Provost Marshal General, which issued regulations, tracked strength, coordinated International Committee of the Red Cross ICRC access, and enforced compliance with the law of war. The law that mattered most day to day was the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Article 11 was unambiguous. The food ration of prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops. In the same chapter, dormitory standards tied space and bedding to the detaining power's own practice, an equalizing clause that turned abstract law into concrete meals and mattresses. This framework was not aspirational text. It was inspected. ICRC delegates traveled to camps, sampled rations, visited infirmaries, received complaints, and reported findings through diplomatic channels. American commands understood that each kitchen and ward stood under a legal light. That is why the routine in the photographs looks so ordinary. Cooks measuring flour, diet sheets pinned to clipboards, medical officers initialing convalescent menus. The ordinariness was the point. It proved that a POW's daily life was regulated by the same logistics and paperwork that fed American units on base. The culture shock for Japanese prisoners began at that ordinary level. The U.S. Army's ration system, built on wheat bread, meat, vegetables, coffee, and frequent dairy, was designed to maintain weight and prevent deficiency, not merely to keep men alive. In hospitals, Army dietitians and nurses treated food as an instrument of recovery. Circulars and Army regulations assigned nurses direct responsibility for ward food service. Diet kitchens operated to physician orders. Convalescent diets leaned on milk, eggs, and sweetened desserts as calorie-dense, easily tolerated components. The tray with pie and a bottle of milk in a Midwestern ward was not charity. It was doctrine, written into professional practice before these prisoners ever reached the fence line. Geography made Wisconsin, Iowa, Colorado, and other inland posts into unlikely Pacific War waypoints. Fort McCoy, then Camp McCoy, became one of the principal destinations for Japanese POWs shipped to the continental United States. The installation's own research describes a complex that, at its wartime peak, held nearly 3,000 Japanese prisoners in addition to other Axis nationals, with dedicated compounds, work details, and a hospital footprint scaled to its population. Local newspapers covered farm labor detachments under guard. Army public affairs documented chapel services and inspections. Archaeologists and historians on post have since reconstructed the camp's layout and daily routines from unit records and site surveys. The numbers were not enormous compared to the millions moving across world fronts, but they were large enough to build a routine that thousands experienced the same way. By the clock, at the mess line, with medical checks and mail call. Against that routine, memory carried a different set of expectations. Training and propaganda inside the imperial system had warned soldiers that capture meant starvation or abuse, and some had witnessed harsh treatment of Allied prisoners elsewhere in the Pacific. The first GI meal, bread, meat, coffee, later milk, collided with those expectations. That collision is visible in the Talicia photographs and echoed in many Allied accounts. Surprise at abundance, suspicion fading into appetite, a dawning comprehension that the detaining power ran its camps by regulation, not by improvisation. It is important to keep the comparison factual. American compliance with Geneva standards did not erase Allied suffering in Japanese custody, nor does it rely on exaggeration of that suffering to make its point. It rests on what is documentable. An American POW system that fed prisoners to depot standards, inspected by the ICRC, and recorded in images and reports. Transit itself reinforced the message. Train cars rolled on published timetables. Arrival meant processing by checklists. Delousing, medical screening, inoculations, and issue of clothing followed in set order. Kitchens mirrored the Army's own. Standardized field ranges where needed. Post bakeries turning out loaves by the rack. Cold storage for dairy and meat. And mess halls with posted menus and portion controls. The language barrier was real, so the system relied on universals, quantity, temperature, regularity, and on interpreters and bilingual camp guides to explain rules and routines. A prisoner could not control much, but he could predict the hour and content of the next meal, and the next one after that. Predictability did moral work that sermons could not. What began at a forward cage under palm trees ended under snow-lined eaves with a hot tray and a signature in ink. Between those points lay a bureaucratic river, provost orders, inspection reports, diet cards, that carried POWs through a life bounded by fences and schedules rather than whim. That is the context the camera enters when it watches a nurse set down bread, pie, and milk, an international rule incorporated into an American routine. The next step is to walk inside that routine, into the kitchens, canteens, and hospital wards where regulation turned into daily practice. The foundation was legal, not sentimental. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, the detaining power owed prisoners food, equivalent in quantity and quality to depot troops, potable water, medical attention, and supervision by neutral inspectors. In the United States, those clauses did not sit in a drawer. They were absorbed into Army regulations and enforced through the office of the Provost Marshal General. Each camp commander signed for compliance. Quartermasters requisitioned against headcount. Surgeons certified medical diets. International Committee of the Red Cross ICRC. Delegates scheduled visits and could arrive again if complaints persisted. Paperwork created predictability. Ration scales, menu cards, storage logs, and inspection reports that tracked calories and quality in the same manner used for American posts. The system also built channels for redress. Prisoners could submit complaints through camp spokesmen or directly to inspectors. Chaplains and interpreters mediated. Command chronologies recorded action taken. Extra clothing issued, heating adjusted, food variety explained, medical rechecks ordered. Where shortages occurred, they were treated as supply problems to be solved, not as policy. The legal promise thus migrated from treaty text to routine practice. A baker mixing dough before dawn. A diet kitchen pouring measured milk. A nurse countersigning a tray ticket for a convalescent. The reach of those signatures, provost, quartermaster, surgeon, inspector, meant the meal on a prisoner's plate was backed by the same machine that fed American Depot. Troops. That is why the moment in a hospital ward feels ordinary to the staff and extraordinary to the patient. It is law, logistics, and supervision arriving at the exact time printed on the day's schedule. The U.S. Army treated food as equipment. Standard rations aimed to maintain weight, prevent deficiency disease, and sustain labor. In hospitals, dietetics focused on recovery. Dense calories, adequate protein, and easily tolerated textures for men rebuilding from malaria, dysentery, ulcers, wounds, or general starvation. Milk was central because it delivered protein, fat, calcium, and vitamins in a form many patients could keep down. Eggs played the same role. Desserts, custards, puddings, ice cream pie were not indulgence but compliance tools. Sweet, soft, high-energy portions that encouraged intake when appetite lagged. Doctors wrote orders. Dietitians translated them into trays. Nurses enforced consumption and recorded results. Weight charts and temperature sheets hung beside beds like flight instruments. Outside the wards, mess halls mirrored the Army's fuel logic. Bread at every meal for bulk and carbohydrate. Coffee and tea for warmth and routine. Meat and vegetables for protein and micronutrients. Variety depended on regional supply. Midwestern posts drew on dairies and grain. Western camps leaned more on beef and canned produce, but the target was constant: depot parity. When substitution was necessary, calorie and protein equivalents were calculated, not guessed. A prisoner hostile to milk on day 1 might accept it by week 3 when dizziness faded and strength returned. A man who could not face meat might finish a custard and half a bottle of milk and gain the same energy. The ward cart looked generous because it was designed to meet numbers written in medical orders, not to flatter taste. For men who had lived by shortage, that cart signaled a different kind of power, the kind that heals by schedule. The first GI meals after capture, bread, meat, coffee served under guard, already hinted at the gap between expectation and reality. Inside American camps, the gap widened into daily proof. A prisoner who had associated enemy custody with starvation now stood in a line that moved, received a measured portion from a ladle, and sat at a table that would be wiped for the next group. He learned that the quantity tomorrow would match today. In hospital wards, he learned that milk and sweets could be prescribed, that nurses watched intake and returned with a calm firmness unfamiliar to men who had survived by hoarding or barter. Reaction varied. Some men distrusted the abundance, sampling slowly, watching for the trick that never arrived. Some recoiled from wheat bread and milk. Habit and culture run deep. Others ate until sleep overcame them and woke astonished to a second breakfast. Over weeks, bodies filled out and nerves steadied. The material shock carried moral weight. Indoctrination had promised cruelty and neglect. Instead, prisoners encountered a regime that treated meals and medicine as duties tied to signatures and inspections. The experience did not erase anger or allegiance, but it changed posture. Men volunteered for controlled work details, cooperated with hospital routines, and wrote letters that described regular food and regular rest. Small sentences that contradicted what they had been told to expect. The camera does not need testimony to feel that shift. It sees it in the quiet of a ward, the squared corners of a blanket, the way a hand steadies a bottle of milk before lifting it. That human recalibration sets up the next layer of explanation, where such steadiness came from inside the wire, command, training, and camp culture that made routine possible. With law, nutrition, and human response established, we can turn to the camp-level machinery that held it all together, and to the comparative lens that made the contrast feel so stark. Order made the meals possible. Camp commanders treated the compound like a post, not a pen. The daily program, reveille, roll call, work details, noon mess, mail call, sick call, evening chow, ran by the same timepieces that governed American units across the fence. Leadership's job was to remove improvisation from survival. Quartermasters fought shortages with substitutions that held the calorie line. Surgeons guarded the right to medical diets. Chaplains and interpreters cooled small frictions before they became large ones. At Fort McCoy and similar posts, the tone filtered downward through non-commissioned officers and civilian specialists who understood that a predictable camp is a safe camp. They wrote it in ledgers: loaves baked, gallons of milk received, pounds of meat issued, hours worked, temperatures recorded on ward rounds. Discipline did not soften, but it sorted. Infractions drew escalating penalties. Weapons and propaganda remained contraband. Escape attempts brought confinement. Yet the bulk of energy went to what kept men steady. Clean barracks, heat in winter, workable labor details, inspections that fixed faults. The ethos was practical. If breakfast is hot and on time, the line forms quietly. If medical orders are honored, the ward stays calm. If pay chits are accurate, The canteen window is not a flashpoint. Leadership did not need to announce mercy. It enforced routine, and routine did the moral work quietly. When the camera finds a milk bottle sweating on a tray, it is looking at leadership expressed as logistics, authority that speaks in schedules and signatures, not speeches. Imperial indoctrination had sketched captivity in nightmare strokes, starvation, beatings, erasure. Those stories traveled with men into the wire. The first American meals did not cancel them. They argued with them, once, twice, and then every 12 hours. The psychological pivot rarely came in a single scene. It accumulated in routines that outlived fear. The same portion at the same hour. The same nurse returning with the same steady insistence. An inspection team that listened, wrote, and returned weeks later to verify a fix. The repeated contradictions had weight. They did not convert ideology. They eroded certainty. A man who expects cruelty reads every kindness as trap. A man who experiences predictability for months begins to plan inside it, volunteering for outdoor work, lining up for classes, keeping his appointment at the infirmary without prompting. American authorities understood this secondary effect without turning the camp into a theater. The message was in the mechanism. Geneva rules were not performed for the camera. They were lived in front of it. When local papers photographed POW farm crews or kitchen lines, they captured a quiet answer to propaganda. Abundance arranged by rule, not whim. For prisoners raised on stories of American decadence, the surprise was not the presence of pie. It was the absence of chaos. A regime that can feed by schedule, heat barracks by plan, and permit letters by regulation is one that displaces fear with calculation. Calculating men are easier to manage than terrified ones. The result showed in posture and in paper. Straighter backs at roll call, calmer wards, letters home that named meals and hours as if those were the true marvels of a strange country. The starkness of reaction cannot be understood without context. Across the Pacific, Allied POWs often endured starvation rations, untreated disease, and lethal transport conditions under Japanese control. Those facts are documented in war crimes records and post-war histories. They do not need embellishment to be grave. Inside American camps, Japanese prisoners encountered the other pole of wartime captivity. Depot parity rations, medical care by schedule, and inspections that treated deficiencies as correctable failures, not policy. The contrast was not theatrical, it was structural. It arose from different legal cultures, logistic systems, and wartime resource positions. For the men in the beds and on the benches, the comparison was personal. A prisoner who had seen an Allied captive beaten for seeking water now watched a U.S. nurse insist he finish 8 ounces of milk because the chart required it. A soldier who had expected to barter for scraps learned that dessert came by order. The moral does not erase either side's suffering or dignity. It clarifies why the moment felt overwhelming when a tray arrived with bread, pie, and milk. The items were ordinary, but their certainty was new. In that certainty lived the deepest shock, a realization that rules could govern even here, that calories could be guaranteed, that recovery could be planned. Understanding that shock readies us for the turning point of this story, not a firefight, but the decisive first weeks when a prisoner's life is reassembled by schedule and care. With the angles in place, the camera is prepared to follow a prisoner through intake, mess, and ward, the sequence in which routine becomes fate. The decisive change did not sound like battle. It sounded like doors opening and closing on schedule. A train braked into a Midwestern siding, brakes hissing pale clouds into winter air. Guards formed a cordon. A medical detachment waited with clipboards and canvas litters. The first minutes followed a script. Count off the cars, form ranks by fives, march by file toward the processing hut. Inside, disinfectant rose sharp in the nose. Clothing went to wire baskets, hair was clipped if ordered. Bodies stepped through delousing showers and came out into rows of towels and a pile of standard-issue garments. Undergarments. Trousers, shirts, socks, shoes that fit as closely as the quartermaster could make them fit. Each man received a number tag, and with it a place in a system that would, for good or ill, always know where he slept and when he ate. Medical screening came next. Corpsmen took temperatures and pulses. A dental table caught cavities and abscesses. A doctor's hand pressed ribs and stomachs, listened at the back for lungs gone to rattle. Malaria scars, tropical ulcers, and the weight loss of months were noted in neat script. Those flagged for the ward walked or rode to the infirmary. Those cleared for barracks received a barracks assignment and a brief and halting translation. The hours of roll call and mess. The penalties for infractions. The path to sick call. The place where letters were censored and mailed. Language bent everything out of shape and then slowly let it relax. The structure carried what words could not. The first meals inside the wire felt ceremonial even when the kitchen treated them as routine. Bells or whistles drew men along plank walks to a mess hall lined with steam. The line moved past tub after tub, bread racks stacked like masonry, kettles of stew, pans of potatoes, coffee urns tilting on their spigots. Ladles measured portions. Cups filled to marks. Trays slid along rails. Men sat where they were told or where habit drew them to corners and edges. Some started with bread, cautious and small bites. Some drank coffee first for heat. Some stared for a minute as if the tray might be withdrawn. Then cutlery clicked, and the hall settled into the steady noise of 100 men eating at once. For the sick, the decisive minutes unfolded in a different room. A nurse wheeled a cart down a ward, where light fell across beds in regular stripes. Each bed had a chart. Each chart held orders. Each order had a diet. Milk bottles sweated in wire racks. Bowls of custard and gelatin trembled on plates. Slices of pie sat beside spoons that had been counted and polished by habit. The nurse checked wrist tags and set trays into waiting hands. She did not hurry and she did not dawdle. At the foot of each bed she marked what was taken, what was left, and what would have to be tried again in an hour. It was not tenderness that made the scene powerful. It was the sense that the same thing would happen tomorrow. Outside the wards, the camp taught its own geometry. Barracks life settled by the day, stoves banked against the cold, blankets squared to inspection, footlockers filled with the small order that fences make necessary. Work details formed at the gate, farm labor, woodcutting, rail yard cleanup guarded and accounted. Men who had held back in the first week began to volunteer, drawn by pay credits for canteen purchases, by the sight of open sky, or by the simple relief that comes from fatigue earned honestly. At the canteen window, a clerk marked chits and slid across soap, writing paper, a tin of something sweet within ration rules. The exchange felt prosaic and therefore remarkable. Inspections arrived and returned. International Committee of the Red Cross delegates walked the kitchens, dipped ladles into kettles to sample the day's ration, and asked questions through interpreters about variety and quantity. They paced the wards and looked into storerooms. They spoke to prisoners privately, took notes, and left the promise to report through channels if something had been amiss. American inspectors did the same in their own columns and forms. The theater of these visits mattered less than their repetition. Everyone in the compound learned that food and medicine were subjects that brought outsiders through the gate on a regular clock. The turning point lived in bodies. Weight charts crept upward in pencil lines. Faces lost the hollowed look that hunger carves along the jaw and under the eyes. Sleep deepened. Letters, where permitted, began to describe a life that would have sounded improbably calm to anyone still in the islands. Bread 3 times a day. Meat most days. Milk in the hospital. A schedule for everything. Men who had hoarded scraps when they first came in let go of the habit not from trust but from proof that today's meal was not a lucky day, and tomorrow's was not a gamble. Proof is a difficult teacher to argue with. There were frictions. Some resented the substitution of wheat for rice. Some distrusted milk as alien. Some refused medical orders and were coaxed or compelled back into compliance. The guard line produced its own incidents and punishments. But those spikes stood up from a landscape that had flattened into routine. Routine brought its own persuasion. It did not convert loyalties and it did not erase grief. It did something slower. It made the nervous system stop bracing for the blow that never came. In that space, cooperation became more common than defiance, not because the wire softened, but because the meal arrived on time. By the end of the first weeks, the camp's logic had asserted itself. Men moved with the bell. The kitchen delivered on the ledger. The hospital advanced its charts with a patience that was almost a kind of silence. The camera, if it returned to the ward, would find the nurse and the cart again. Bread, something sweet, and milk measured to the ounce, and understand that the strongest change in a prisoner's life was not a single kindness, but the certainty that tomorrow would look like today. That certainty is the hinge of this story. The next scene tests it in the place where hearts are rawest and bodies most fragile. The ward where convalescence and culture shock meet on a tray. Morning. Rounds began with the scrape of the cart's wheels across linoleum. Light came in clean angles through high windows, finding dust motes in the glint on bottle caps. Beds ran in 2 rows, blankets squared, charts clipped at the foot. The ward smelled of soap, coffee, and disinfectant, a precise mixture that meant order more than comfort. Nurses moved in a practice circuit. Check, note, adjust. Check, note, adjust. The cart followed, stacked with measured things. Bowls whose temperatures had been taken. Bottles whose ounces had been tallied. Plates that matched a handwritten line on a diet order. The men in these beds carried the Pacific in their bodies. Malaria left the waxy sallowness that outlives fever. Dysentery had thinned limbs to sticks. Ulcers made breath shallow and careful. Old shrapnel lived under skin where it would likely remain. Each case was specific. The routine that met it was general and deliberate. Calories and protein first, then rest. Then gradual movement. Sitting up longer, walking to the latrine, standing in the sun for a minute under a guard's quiet eye. Charts translated that progress into fact. Weights penciled into a rising line, temperatures that settled, notes trimmed from paragraphs to single words. The tray that drew the camera came near the end of a round. Bread soft, still faintly warm from the post-bakery. A wedge of pie set on its plate with the crust intact. A small bottle of milk cold enough to sweat. The nurse checked a wrist tag, glanced at the chart, and set the tray in careful reach. Nothing in her face announced a moment. To the staff, this was compliance with a prescription. 8 ounces of milk for calcium and fat. A sweet portion for energy and appetite. Soft bread for bulk and ease. To the man in the bed, it was the plainest sum of all the contradictions gathered since capture. Scarcity replaced by surplus. Unpredictability by schedule. Fear by a habit that refused to change even when watched. He lifted the bottle first. The glass was cool. The taste landed with the bluntness of things once common and then lost. Nurses did not linger to witness emotions. They had tasks to complete. But a ward teaches you to recognize certain silences. In some beds, men ate methodically, as if proving to themselves that the meal would not be withdrawn. In others, hands shook, whether from illness or from the relief that catches at the throat when the body realizes it is safe enough to want. The pie held its own meaning. Sugar speaks directly. It told the nervous system that there would be enough again. A Red Cross delegate in a dark coat stood near the end of the row, accompanied by a camp officer and an interpreter. Inspections did not turn the ward into a display. They confirmed that everyday life matched paper. The delegate watched the rounds, asked a quiet question about special diets, and made a small note. Later, he would sample from the general kettles in the kitchen, taste the stew, check the bread's crumb, confirm that milk deliveries matched the ledger and the icehouse inventory. These steps were not pageantry. They were the spine of a promise that the tray would look the same next week, and the week after, regardless of who walked through the door to check. Elsewhere on post, the camp's machines reinforced what the ward taught. The bakery's output rose and fell with headcount, not with mood. Quartermasters reconciled receipts and issues. Discrepancies triggered inquiries that resolved to numbers, not to shrugs. The guard line kept its distance from the hospital except when called. Orderlies and nurses ran their domain by chart and habit. That separation mattered. It told patients that recovery was governed by medical logic, not by the temper of the nearest rifle. Culture did not vanish at the threshold. Wheat bread remained foreign to palates formed on rice. Milk remained suspect to stomachs that had done without it. Some men refused at first, then accepted in small sips, then reached for the bottle without prompting as the dizziness receded and a steadier hunger returned. Some never embraced certain tastes, and substitutions were found that met the numbers without forcing the tongue. The constant was the constancy itself. The tray at the hour printed, the portion in the measure specified, the quiet expectation that it would be consumed for the sake of healing. By the second week, the ward looked different in small ways that add up. Faces rounded, eyes cleared, postures straightened even lying down. Conversations grew a little longer. When a man could cross the room without stopping, the nurse noted it with the same spare handwriting she used to record temperatures. Achievements were entered without ceremony because ceremony belongs to events. This was routine, and routine was the point. In letters that passed the censor's stamp, where words were careful and the facts plain, sentences kept reappearing. The food is regular. The milk is cold. I am gaining. The turning point is quiet enough to miss if you listen only for dramatic sounds. It is a glass bottle set down on metal with a small click. It is a fork placed on a plate and a pencil line that rises half a pound this week. It is a schedule that no longer needs to be explained, because the body has learned it before the mind has agreed. In the logic of the camp, this is where resistance changes shape, not to consent but to cooperation with the terms of survival. Work details accept more volunteers. Barracks inspections tighten without argument. The canteen line lengthens on payday. On the ward, trays come back to the cart empty more often than not. When the nurse wheels the cart away and the light slides another inch along the floor, the decisive work is already done. A prisoner's expectations have been replaced by experiences that repeat. The war has not ended for him. Allegiance has not shifted. But a life inside the wire has acquired a rhythm that preserves rather than erodes. From that rhythm, everything in the camp takes its cue. The camera can now pull back from the bed through the ward past the kitchens, across the fence to consider what this quiet revolution produced in numbers and consequences for both sides. When order holds day after day, it leaves a paper trail. The first consequence of the ward's routine was numerical. Weights recorded, calories issued, bottles counted back into wire racks empty. In morning briefings, the surgeon read the ward census, admissions, discharges to barracks, transfers to dental or x-ray, followed by a short line that mattered as much as any. Average gain this week, 1 to 2 pounds for men at the lowest baselines. The quartermaster answered with his own arithmetic. Loaves baked, gallons of milk received, pounds of meat issued, substitutions by equivalent calories when rail cars missed a connection. Together, those ledgers told the same story the camera saw, recovery by schedule. Formal oversight followed the same rhythm. International Committee of the Red Cross delegates turned inspection into a calendar event without drama. They sampled kettles, checked storerooms, spoke privately with prisoners through interpreters, and read diet cards at the foot of beds. When something fell short, variety, heat, bedding, they noted it, returned, and verified the fix. Army inspectors worked in parallel. Preventive medicine teams walked latrines and wash houses. Supply officers traced shortages back to depots. Training memoranda tightened food handling practice where needed. None of this made headlines, yet it hardened the system. If a promise can be measured, it can be enforced. Camp strength numbers settled into their own pattern. In compounds holding Japanese prisoners, the population rose and fell with the arrivals from theater and the departures to other posts and harvest details. Work detachments expanded in spring and summer when farms needed hands and shrank in winter when the land slept under snow. The ledger that mattered inside the fence, however, was not just the head count. It was the infraction rate. As men recovered, petty tensions flared and then cooled into routine. The disciplinary log still recorded contraband, scuffles, or attempts to game the canteen, but the frequency dropped as predictability replaced improvisation. A quiet barracks is not an accident. It is the dividend of a hot breakfast served on time and a clinic that admits without argument at sick call. Mail told the story in softer lines. Letters that passed through the censor's stamp carried the same unadorned sentences across oceans. The food is regular. I have gained weight. I am assigned to work outside the wire. There is a hospital if we are ill. Those sentences did quiet work among families who had been taught to expect the opposite, and among intelligence officers who read tone as carefully as fact. They also shaped behavior in the compound itself. Men who expected starvation hoarded. Men who experienced certainty planned. They lined up for classes. They joined work details for pay credits and the relief of movement. In the hospital, they kept appointments because appointments kept them. Local communities registered the aftermath in practical ways. Harvests were brought in on time because watched work details filled gaps left by the draft. Dairies along the rail lines delivered to posts that paid their invoices and returned their crates on schedule. Newspapers printed small box stories about POW crews in fields or in sawmills under guard. The photographs showing wool caps, work gloves, and faces turned to the same winter light as the civilians who worked beside them. The images did not sensationalize. They normalized a fact of wartime America. Camps were not aberrations at the edge of the map. They were part of the home front's daily machinery. For camp leadership, the aftermath sharpened doctrine. After-action notes from inspections and audits refined the unglamorous parts of the mission. Rotation plans for bakers, preventive medicine checklists for kitchens, language cards for mess lines, Standard operating procedures for diet kitchens adjacent to wards. Commanders learned that the fastest way to calm a compound was through the quartermaster and the surgeon. Keep the menu steady, keep the clinic open on posted hours, keep the ward carts moving. The guard line mattered, but it mattered most when the interior systems were already working. There were limits no schedule could erase. Winter bit hard along the fences even with coal stacked high. Wheat remained wheat to pallets formed on rice. Milk never became beloved by everyone. Yet recovery showed in faces and posture. In the sound a mess hall made when a line moved without friction. In the quiet at lights out after a day spent in cold air and predictable labor. The ethics showed in the same places, on the plate, on the chart, in the inspection book that closed with a signature rather than an argument. What these ledgers and routines produced beyond the wire, inside commands, in strategy and in memory, would define the larger consequences. The next section follows those longer lines, how a system of rations, nursing and inspection altered attitudes, shaped repatriation, and fed into the way the war and its aftermath would be remembered. The larger consequences of routine reach past fences. For the U.S. Army, adherence to Geneva standards inside domestic camps became part of an argument about who held the moral initiative in a total war. Commanders could answer allegations with forms and figures, ration scales that matched depot issues, inspection certificates signed by neutral delegates, convalescent wards that ran on medical orders rather than improvisation. This was not decoration. It was policy as strategy, a state that can feed and treat its enemies by schedule signals, confidence in law and supply, signals that travel through diplomatic channels, through press photographs, and eventually, through the memories of the men who lived under those rules. Inside the wire, the long tail of care showed up in cooperation. As health stabilized, more prisoners volunteered for permitted labor. Agricultural counties came to rely on guarded work crews during planting and harvest. Camps expanded language classes and technical courses because men who feel tomorrow's meal is certain will plan for something after it. The guard line did not relax. Escapes were still punished, contraband still seized. But friction ebbed when the kitchen and the clinic were the camp's most predictable institutions. A compound stabilized by routine does not simply run more quietly. It absorbs shocks better when they come. There were diplomatic effects. Inspection reports and mail flows demonstrated that camps functioned within the law. In a war scarred by atrocities elsewhere, those documents mattered when Washington argued for reciprocal treatment of Allied captives and when it prepared the moral ground for the post-war order. The language of parity, equivalent in quantity and quality to depot troops, moved from treaty text into lived experience that could be pointed to by name, a camp, a ward, a date, a ledger. In hearings and histories, those specifics weighed more than claims. For Japanese prisoners, the aftermath unfolded along more intimate lines. Some letters home, where permitted, described the shock of predictability as if it were a strange climate. Meals that arrived, medicines that worked, nurses who enforced diets with a professionalism that did not ask questions about loyalty. These were not conversions. They were records of experience that complicated propaganda. Years later, men who had spent months in American custody would recall the routine with a peculiar precision. Smells, hours, the way milk bottles sweated on metal trays. Because repetition fixes memory. In interviews and memoirs, such details often sit beside stark recollections of battlefield terror and loss, not to balance them, but to show how a life can be rebuilt by schedule, even when the larger war accelerates elsewhere. The effect radiated to American communities that hosted the camps. Local newspapers carried small notices about POW work crews and hospital donations. Church groups sent books. Dairies and mills met steady contracts through the railheads. The presence of an enemy population under guard inside a lawful regime taught its own civics lesson. Citizens could see that the country's stated rules applied even when no camera was expected, even when the subject was not sympathetic. In that sense, the camps became part of the home front's moral economy. After victory, repatriation and war crimes proceedings placed these experiences into a broader accounting. Compliance in U.S. camps did not erase the suffering of Allied prisoners elsewhere, and it did not insulate every institution from criticism, but it strengthened the argument that treatment is policy, not mood. Men returned across the Pacific through a chain of papers and signatures, the same administrative river that had carried them in. And many carried an impression that would linger. Within the wire, food and medicine had been governed by rules strong enough to outlast fear. Limits remained. No schedule could make captivity dignified. No measured tray could restore what hunger and disease had taken in the islands. Cultural discomfort with certain foods never entirely vanished. Winter cold cut through barracks walls despite coal and discipline. Yet the system did what it promised most days. Kept weight on, kept tempers lower, kept disease at bay, kept letters moving. Those are unglamorous achievements, and in a history crowded with decisive battles, they can look small. They are not. They are the infrastructure of the values the victors said they were fighting for. The numbers and routines then flow into a final question. What did it mean beyond calories and charts for a nurse to set down bread, pie, and milk at a prisoner's bedside and expect him to finish? The answer belongs to reflection more than to report, because it touches the place where policy becomes feeling and where a schedule becomes a promise. What endures from this story is not the image of wire or the sound of boots on plank walkways. It is a smaller sound, the light click of glass on metal as a nurse sets down a bottle of milk beside a bed, and the quieter sound that follows when a man lifts it and drinks. In a war that measured victory in islands seized and convoys sunk, this seems too ordinary to matter. Yet the ordinary is where rules reveal their strength. A schedule kept in a place built to hold enemies says more about power than any speech. It says the state believes its own law enough to live by it when no one applauds. Pie and milk were not symbols when they were issued. They were calories written into orders and delivered by hands that had other beds to reach, other charts to sign. But to the men who had learned to expect the opposite, they became proof that the day could be trusted. Trust is not tenderness. It is repetition. It is bread at breakfast again and again. It is medicine at the hour printed on the card. It is an inspection that returns because it said it would. In those repetitions, the nervous system stops bracing, and the body begins to rebuild. That is policy felt rather than declared. There is a human symmetry here that does not excuse and does not erase. Elsewhere in the Pacific, hunger and cruelty cut deep scars that post-war trials would tally in sober lists. Inside the American camps, another ledger filled. Weights gained, gallons delivered, complaints recorded and answered. Both ledgers belong to the same war. To acknowledge one does not diminish the other. It clarifies what was possible when a nation chose to bind itself to a rule and then made that rule routine. So the final shot does not linger on the fence or the watchtower. It holds on a ward at morning, light finding enamel and glass, the nurse's calm hand, the patient's deliberate swallow. The war is still raging beyond the window. Nothing about captivity becomes gentle. But in this room, a promise is kept one tray at a time, and a man who expected starvation finds that law can taste like milk, that dignity can be measured in ounces, and that mercy, when it is strongest, arrives by schedule. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.